There is a specific moment that separates the people who transform their lives from the people who spend their entire lives hoping to. It is not talent. It is not luck. It is the moment someone stops waiting and starts becoming. Think about that distinction carefully, because most people don't actually see themselves as waiting. They see themselves as preparing, as being patient, as being realistic about timing. But strip away the language, and what remains, in far more cases than people admit, is simply waiting, dressed up to feel more acceptable. Here's what waiting actually costs, and it rarely announces itself dramatically. It doesn't feel like loss in the moment. It feels like safety, like reasonable caution, like something responsible people do before making a big move. But every day spent waiting is a day the becoming doesn't happen, a day the version of you capable of handling what you want stays exactly as undeveloped as it was yesterday, because becoming isn't something that arrives through time passing. It arrives through repeated action, taken specifically during the time that would otherwise have been spent waiting. Think about the difference between these two words carefully, because they represent fundamentally different relationships with your own future. Waiting positions you as a passive recipient, someone whose life improves once external conditions finally align. Becoming positions you as an active participant, someone whose life improves because of what you consistently do, regardless of whether conditions have aligned yet or not. One of these puts your future in the hands of circumstance. The other puts it directly in yours. Now understand something important about why waiting feels so justified in the moment it happens. It usually attaches itself to a reasonable sounding condition. I'll start once I have more time. I'll commit once I feel more confident. I'll begin once the timing makes more sense. Each of these conditions sounds sensible individually. But notice something about all of them. None of them have a clear finish line. More time rarely arrives on its own. Confidence rarely appears before action, only after it. Better timing is a moving target that keeps moving precisely because it was never really about timing at all. Think about how many people have been waiting for one of these exact conditions for years, sometimes decades, without ever quite arriving at the point where waiting stops and becoming starts. This isn't because they lack sincerity. Most of them genuinely believe they're going to begin once the condition is met. The problem is that the condition itself was never designed to be met. It exists specifically because it allows the comfort of intention without requiring the risk of action. Now let's talk about what becoming actually requires, because it's simpler than most people expect, though simple doesn't mean easy. Becoming requires doing today, in some small way, the thing that the future version of you would already be doing consistently. Not a grand version of it, not a perfect version of it. A small, honest version, repeated daily, until the doing itself becomes who you are, rather than something you occasionally attempt when conditions feel right. Think about a specific example. If you want to become someone disciplined with their health, waiting looks like planning the perfect routine before starting anything. Becoming looks like moving your body today, imperfectly, without the ideal plan, yet fully formed. If you want to become someone financially disciplined, waiting looks like researching every possible strategy before saving a single dollar. Becoming looks like saving something today, however small, while the research continues alongside the action rather than before it. Now here's the deeper truth underneath both of these examples. Becoming was never about doing everything correctly from the very beginning. It was about beginning at all, imperfectly, and letting the correction happen through the process rather than before it. This single shift from correctness before action to action before correctness is often the exact thing separating people who eventually become who they want to be from people who spend years preparing for a beginning that never actually arrives. Think about why this shift feels so uncomfortable to make, even once you understand it intellectually. Doing something imperfectly, in public, or even just in private, where only you will notice, activates a kind of exposure most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If you wait, you protect an image of yourself as someone who would have done it well had they only started. If you act imperfectly, that protective image disappears, replaced by direct evidence of exactly where your current skill, discipline, or capability actually stands. That evidence can feel more threatening than the discomfort of never starting at all. Here's what's worth understanding about that threat, though. The image you're protecting by waiting was never real to begin with. It was a hypothetical version of you, untested, unproven, existing only in imagination. The moment you act, even imperfectly, you trade that hypothetical image for something far more valuable. Actual information about where you stand, which is the only thing that can ever be improved. You cannot improve a hypothetical. You can only improve something real, something that exists because you actually did it. Think about how this reframes the discomfort of beginning imperfectly. It's not a risk to your identity. It's the only path toward the identity you're actually trying to build. Every skilled person you admire began exactly where you currently stand, doing the thing badly before doing it well, exposing their early, unpolished attempts to the same scrutiny you're currently trying to avoid by waiting. Their becoming wasn't protected from that exposure. It was built directly through it. Now let's talk about the specific role of consistency in this process, because a single imperfect action taken once doesn't create becoming on its own. It creates a starting point, nothing more. What actually builds the identity you're working toward is repetition, the same imperfect action, or a slightly improved version of it, repeated across days and weeks till the discomfort of doing it fades and something closer to instinct replaces it. Think about how this repetition compounds in a way that isn't obvious in the early stages. The first time you do something new, it requires enormous conscious effort, and the results often feel unremarkable, sometimes even discouraging. The 10th time requires less effort, and the results start showing small, measurable improvement. By the 50th or 100th time, the action has become significantly easier, and the results have become undeniable, not because any single repetition was extraordinary, but because the accumulation of ordinary repetitions eventually produces something that looks, from the outside, like a dramatic transformation. Now, here's something worth sitting with honestly. Most people quit somewhere in that early stretch, before the compounding effect becomes visible, precisely because the early results don't yet reflect the effort being invested. This is where waiting tries to reassert itself in a new disguise, not as waiting to begin, but as waiting for proof that the effort is working before continuing further. But proof, in this context, almost always arrives after a longer stretch of consistency than people expect, which means quitting during that early stretch guarantees you'll never actually see the proof that would have justified continuing. Think about reframing your relationship with this early stretch, understanding in advance that the lack of visible results doesn't mean the effort isn't working. It means the effort hasn't yet accumulated to the point of visibility, which is a completely different thing. Muscle grows during the stretch, where you can't yet see it growing. Skill develops during the stretch, where it still feels clumsy and inconsistent. Financial discipline compounds during the stretch, where the account balance still looks nearly the same as it did months earlier. In every case, the invisible stretch isn't evidence of failure. It's simply the necessary, unavoidable middle section of any process that eventually produces visible transformation. Now let's talk about what sustains someone through that invisible stretch. Because motivation alone rarely lasts long enough to carry a person all the way through it. Motivation tends to be strongest at the very beginning, when the idea of becoming still feels novel and exciting, and weakest somewhere in the middle, exactly when the invisible stretch is testing whether the commitment was genuine or simply a passing burst of enthusiasm. What carries people through that weakened middle stretch isn't motivation. It's identity, the quiet decision made independently of how motivated you feel on any given day that this is simply who you are now, regardless of whether today happens to feel inspiring or not. Think about how this identity gets built, because it doesn't arrive through declaration alone. Saying to yourself, I am someone disciplined, or I am someone who follows through, doesn't create that identity on its own. Identity gets built the same way. Everything else discussed here gets built through repeated action that confirms the statement, till the statement stops being an aspiration and starts being an accurate description of how you actually operate. Words alone are cheap. Identity is expensive, paid for in consistent daily behavior, especially on the days that behavior feels inconvenient or unnecessary. Here's something worth examining honestly about your own history with this process. Think about the goals you've abandoned in the past, not to create shame, but to understand the pattern more clearly. In most cases, the abandonment didn't happen because the goal was wrong, or because you lacked the ability to achieve it. It happened somewhere in that invisible middle stretch, when motivation had faded and identity hadn't yet solidified enough to carry the commitment forward on its own. Understanding this pattern in advance is one of the most useful tools available, because it means you can recognize the exact moment it's likely to happen again, rather than being surprised by it each time. Now let's talk about what it means to prepare for that moment before it arrives, rather than hoping to avoid it altogether. You cannot skip the invisible middle stretch. Every meaningful process includes it. What you can do is anticipate it, understanding clearly that somewhere after the initial motivation fades and before the results become visible, there will be a stretch where continuing feels arbitrary, unrewarded, and difficult to justify through logic alone. Knowing this in advance transforms that stretch from a surprising crisis into an expected phase, one you've already decided to move through regardless of how it feels while you're inside it. Think about the specific decision this requires, made in advance, before the difficulty actually arrives. It sounds something like this. Regardless of how unmotivated I feel, regardless of how invisible my progress seems, I am continuing anyway, because I've already decided this is who I am now, not something contingent on daily feelings or immediate evidence. This decision, made clearly and in advance, becomes something to return to, specifically during the stretch where it matters most, rather than something you're trying to invent fresh in the exact moment your motivation has already run out. Now let's talk about a specific trap that tends to appear during this invisible stretch. One that looks like wisdom but functions like another form of waiting. It's the temptation to pause and reassess entirely, to question whether the entire direction was wrong, to consider switching to something that might produce faster, more visible results. This reassessment can feel responsible, even strategic. But notice something important about its timing. It almost always arrives exactly during the stretch, where any consistent effort would feel discouraging, regardless of whether the direction itself was actually correct. Think about how this timing reveals the reassessment for what it usually is. If the discouragement of the invisible stretch is what's triggering the doubt, then switching directions doesn't actually solve anything. It simply restarts the entire process somewhere else, guaranteeing you'll eventually hit another invisible stretch in the new direction as well, at which point the same doubt will likely resurface again. This is how some people spend years moving between different goals, never quite completing any of them, always changing direction right as the difficult middle stretch of the previous goal was testing their commitment. Now understand the alternative to this pattern, which isn't stubbornly refusing to ever reconsider direction, but simply recognizing when reconsideration is being driven by genuine new information versus when it's being driven by the temporary discouragement of an invisible stretch that would pass regardless of direction. Genuine reconsideration usually comes with specific concrete reasons unrelated to how you currently feel. Discouragement-driven reconsideration usually comes with vague dissatisfaction, a general sense that something isn't working without a clear, specific alternative reason beyond the fact that progress doesn't feel fast enough yet. Think about applying this distinction to your own current goals, whatever they happen to be right now. Is any hesitation you're currently feeling rooted in specific, concrete new information? Or is it rooted in the discomfort of an invisible stretch that simply hasn't produced visible results yet? Answering this honestly, rather than assuming the discomfort itself is evidence of a wrong direction, often reveals that the correct response isn't to change course, but simply to continue through the stretch you're currently standing inside. Now let's talk about what happens once you've moved through several of these invisible stretches successfully, because the experience changes something important about how you approach every future one. The first invisible stretch you push through feels almost unbearable because you have no prior evidence that pushing through actually leads anywhere. You're operating purely on decision without the reassurance of personal history to lean on. But once you've completed that first stretch and seen, eventually, the results that were quietly accumulating the entire time, something shifts. You now have direct evidence that the pattern works, evidence that becomes available to reference the next time an invisible stretch arrives somewhere else in your life. Think about how much easier the second invisible stretch becomes. Because of this evidence, even though the discomfort itself doesn't necessarily decrease, the discomfort of not seeing results is still present. What changes is your interpretation of that discomfort. Instead of experiencing it as possible proof that the whole effort is failing, you begin experiencing it as a familiar, expected phase, one you've already moved through successfully before, which makes moving through it again feel less like an open question and more like a known process you're simply repeating. Now here's something worth understanding about why this matters so much for the specific idea of becoming rather than waiting. Waiting never builds this kind of evidence because waiting, by definition, doesn't produce direct experience of moving through difficulty toward a result. It only produces experience of remaining still, hoping conditions will eventually shift on their own. This is part of why waiting tends to perpetuate itself so effectively. It never generates the kind of evidence that would make the next instance of waiting easier to interrupt. Becoming, by contrast, generates exactly that evidence. Each time you push through an invisible stretch and eventually witness what was quietly building underneath it. Think about the compounding relationship between these two patterns over the span of years, not just months. Someone who has spent years primarily waiting accumulates almost no evidence of their own capability to move through difficulty toward a result, which makes the next attempt at becoming feel just as uncertain and difficult as the very first attempt ever did. Someone who has spent years primarily becoming, even through only a few completed processes, accumulates a growing body of evidence, making each subsequent attempt slightly less daunting than the one before it, because the pattern itself has become familiar, tested, and trusted through direct experience rather than theory. Now let's talk about the specific role of small commitments in building this evidence early. Because you don't need to select some enormous, life-altering goal as your first proof that becoming actually works. In fact, starting with something modest often works better, precisely because the invisible stretch is shorter and the evidence arrives sooner, giving you a faster reference point to draw on when tackling something larger later. Think about a small commitment you could realistically sustain for 2 or 3 weeks, something specific enough that you'll know clearly whether you kept it or not. This isn't about the size of the achievement. It's about generating direct evidence as quickly as possible that the pattern of becoming, rather than waiting, actually produces something real. Think about what this small evidence does for your confidence heading into a larger commitment afterward. It doesn't guarantee the larger commitment will be easy. It simply removes one specific doubt, the doubt about whether you're even the kind of person capable of following through on a decision once made. That specific doubt, quietly resolved through a small, completed commitment, removes a significant obstacle standing between you and attempting something more ambitious next. Now let's talk about what becoming actually looks like once it's fully underway, not in the early stages of building evidence, but further along, once the identity has genuinely solidified. It stops requiring the same conscious effort it once did. Actions that used to require deliberate decision-making each time start happening with far less internal resistance, not because the actions became objectively easier, but because the identity behind them has become settled enough that resistance simply has less to attach itself to. Think about what it means to reach this settled stage, because it's worth understanding clearly so you recognize the shift when it eventually arrives in your own experience. It doesn't announce itself with any dramatic marker. There's no specific day where you wake up and suddenly feel completely transformed. Instead, you simply notice, gradually, that something which used to require significant internal negotiation now happens with barely any friction at all. The version of you that used to debate whether to follow through has quietly been replaced by a version that simply does, without the exhausting internal argument that used to precede every instance. Here's something important to understand about this settled stage, though, because it can create a subtle new risk once it arrives. Once an action becomes automatic, it's easy to mistake that automation for permanent security, as though the identity, once built, no longer requires any ongoing attention. But identity, even once settled, isn't entirely immune to erosion if the underlying behavior stops being practiced. This doesn't mean you need to remain in a constant state of effortful vigilance forever. It simply means the identity remains connected to the behavior that built it. And if that behavior disappears for long enough, the identity built through it can gradually weaken as well. Think about this less as a discouraging warning and more as a simple, practical reality worth keeping in mind. The becoming you've built through consistent action doesn't need to be protected through anxious, constant monitoring. It simply needs occasional reconnection with the behavior that originally created it, enough to keep the pattern active, rather than allowing it to fade through prolonged disuse. This is far less demanding than the original process of building the identity, precisely because you're maintaining something already established rather than constructing something entirely new. Now let's talk about how this entire framework applies directly to whatever specific situation currently has you waiting rather than becoming. Think about that situation clearly, the same one this message may have already brought to mind earlier. Consider which condition you've been quietly waiting for, whether it's more time, more confidence, better timing, or some other version of the same underlying pattern. Now consider what a small, honest, imperfect first action would actually look like today, without waiting for that condition to arrive first. Think about what becoming would require in this exact situation. Not the polished, fully formed version eventually possible, but the small, rough, entirely imperfect version available right now, immediately, without any further preparation required. This is where the shift from waiting to becoming actually happens. Not in some future moment when conditions finally feel right, but in this specific, ordinary moment, through whatever small action is genuinely available to you as you're reading or listening to this right now. Now let's talk about what happens if this small action doesn't go particularly well, because it's worth addressing directly rather than leaving unspoken. It might feel awkward. It might not produce the result you were hoping for. It might even confirm some of the doubts that kept you waiting in the first place. None of that actually matters as much as it feels like it does in the moment, because a single action was never meant to prove everything on its own. It was only ever meant to begin the accumulation of evidence discussed earlier, the same accumulation that eventually builds toward the settled identity of becoming rather than waiting. Think about releasing the pressure for this first action to be impressive, successful, or even particularly good. Its only job is to exist, to interrupt the pattern of waiting with something real, however small or imperfect, that something happens to be. Everything after this first action, the repetition, the invisible stretch, the eventual results, the settled identity, depends entirely on this first step existing at all. Without it, none of the rest becomes possible, regardless of how much intellectual understanding you've gathered about the process. Now let's talk about time, because time plays a different role in this process than most people initially assume. Waiting treats time as something that will eventually solve the problem on its own, as though enough days passing will naturally produce readiness, confidence, or better circumstances. But time alone produces almost nothing. It is not time that builds becoming. It is what happens inside that time, specifically the actions taken or not taken during it, that determines whether a year passes with genuine transformation or simply passes, identical at the end to how it looked at the beginning. Think about two people, starting from the exact same point, facing the exact same goal. One spends the next year waiting for the right conditions to arrive before beginning. The other spends the next year becoming, taking small, imperfect action consistently, moving through invisible stretches, accumulating evidence along the way. At the end of that year, the amount of time that passed was identical for both of them. But the outcome is nowhere close to identical because time was never the actual variable that mattered. Action within that time was always the real determining factor, and one person used it while the other simply let it pass. Now, understand something important about how this comparison should actually function in your own thinking. It's not meant to create pressure or comparison against some external standard. It's meant to clarify exactly where your own agency actually exists. You cannot control how much time passes. It moves forward regardless of what you decide. But you have complete control over whether that passing time gets filled with action or with waiting, and that specific choice, repeated daily, is the entire difference between the two paths just described. Think about the version of yourself 1 year from today, existing already in potential, waiting only to be shaped by whatever you decide to do with the time between now and then. That version isn't fixed. It isn't predetermined by circumstances outside your control. It is being actively created right now through whether today becomes another day of waiting or the first of many days spent becoming. This is not abstract. It is exactly as concrete and immediate as the next decision you're about to make once this message ends. Now let's talk about what makes today specifically significant beyond simply being another ordinary day like all the others. Today matters not because of anything unique about the date itself, but because it's the only day you actually have direct access to right now. Yesterday is finished, unreachable, no longer available for action. Tomorrow doesn't yet exist, still hypothetical, not yet real enough to act within. Today is the only point where the shift from waiting to becoming can actually happen, because it's the only point where you currently stand. Think about how much power exists in that simple fact once you actually absorb it. Every plan for tomorrow, every intention for next week, every commitment for next month remains entirely theoretical until it eventually becomes today, at which point it either gets acted upon or gets postponed again. The same way it may have already been postponed several times before. This is why waiting so easily disguises itself as planning. Planning for the future feels productive, even virtuous, but it changes nothing until the future it's planning for actually arrives as today, and today is met with action rather than another round of preparation. Now, as this message moves toward its conclusion, think about the specific decision available to you right now in whatever today this happens to be for you. Not a decision about your entire future, not a decision requiring certainty about how everything will unfold. Simply a decision about what you'll do in the next hour, the next day, with whatever small, honest, imperfect action is genuinely available to you right now, in service of the becoming you've been waiting to begin. Now let's talk about what it means to close the gap between hearing this message and actually living differently because of it, because that gap is exactly where most insight quietly disappears without ever changing anything real. You could finish this message, feel genuinely moved by it, and still walk directly back into the exact same pattern of waiting that's been operating for years, simply because understanding alone was never the actual mechanism of change. Action was always the mechanism. Understanding only ever pointed toward where that action needed to happen. Think about the specific risk of treating this message as complete once you've finished absorbing it intellectually. It isn't complete at that point. It's only complete once something in your actual behavior shifts. Because of it, however small that shift happens to be. A message like this can be agreed with entirely, nodded along to completely, and still leave a person exactly where they started, if the agreement never translates into a single concrete action taken differently than it would have been taken otherwise. Now let's talk about what that concrete action might look like for you specifically, based on everything covered here. Think back to the condition you've been quietly waiting for, the one identified earlier. More time, more confidence, better timing, or whatever version of it applies to your particular situation. Now think about the smallest possible version of becoming available to you today, not tomorrow. Not once this message fully sinks in, but today, in whatever time remains available to you before this day ends. Think about how small this action is allowed to be, because there's often a hidden assumption that the first step toward becoming needs to be significant enough to prove real commitment. It doesn't. The smallest possible version, taken today, does more to interrupt the pattern of waiting than a much larger version postponed until tomorrow or next week. Size was never the deciding factor. Timing was, and the only timing that actually interrupts waiting is immediate timing, today, regardless of how modest the action itself happens to be. Now let's talk one final time about the invisible stretch, because it's worth returning to as this message closes, since it's the exact place most attempts at becoming eventually get abandoned. You now understand that this stretch is expected, not a sign of failure. You understand that evidence accumulates even when it isn't yet visible. You understand that reconsidering direction during this stretch is usually driven by discouragement rather than genuine new information. Carrying this understanding forward doesn't make the stretch disappear, but it does change how you interpret it when it eventually arrives, which is often the exact difference between continuing through it and abandoning the process right before the results were about to become visible. Think about the version of your life that exists on the other side of consistently choosing becoming over waiting, not as a single dramatic event, but as an accumulated result of many ordinary days, each one containing a small decision to act rather than delay. That version isn't guaranteed. Nothing about this process guarantees a specific outcome, but it is available, genuinely available, through nothing more complicated than the willingness to begin today, continue through the invisible stretch, and keep choosing action over waiting each time the old pattern quietly tries to reassert itself. Now understand the deeper truth this entire message has been building toward. Waiting was never actually protecting you from anything real. It was only ever protecting you from the temporary discomfort of imperfect beginnings. Discomfort that fades quickly once you're actually moving, replaced eventually by evidence, then by momentum, then by an identity that no longer requires the same conscious effort it once did. Becoming was always available. It only ever required the decision to stop waiting for permission that was never actually required and start acting instead, today, imperfectly, consistently, until becoming stops being something you're working toward and starts being simply who you are. Stop waiting, start becoming. Not someday, not once conditions finally align, but today, in whatever small, honest, imperfect way is genuinely available to you right now. The version of you waiting on the other side of this decision has been ready this entire time. All that remains is beginning.